It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Sella Nevo. Sella Nevo co-founded Probably Good, an impact-focused career advice organization. He also directs RAND's Biosecurity Center. He's previously founded the Karmel group at Google, which performs machine learning research for humanitarian, global development, and climate-related causes, and has taught applied ethics and information security at Tel Aviv University. In his free time, which Sella clearly has a lot of, he's also on the advisory board of ALLFED and a venture partner at the VC firm First Time. The topic that Sella will be addressing today is high-impact careers in global health and development. Just before we get started, as a reminder, if you have questions for Sella, feel free to submit them via Swapcard, and I'll be going through as many of them as possible during our Q&A session. If we don't get to your questions, please feel free to come to Sella's office hour, which will be right after this talk at Quayside 2. If you don't know where that is, I'm probably not the right person to help you, but I hope you find it. So without further ado, please welcome Sella Nevo.
Okay, hi everyone. As you must have inferred, my name is Sella, and I want to talk to you about three things today. First, I want to give you some context about Probably Good in general, and about the topic of this talk, kind of setting things up. Then we'll go through what is the main kind of purpose of this talk, which is talking about several, specifically 6 career paths in global health and development that we've looked into and found to be potentially promising. And then finally, talk about 3 pieces of advice that we've found seem to go beyond a specific career path, but come up again and again in various global health and development careers. And hopefully those can be useful for anyone wanting to pursue a global health and development career, whether they're interested in these specific paths or not. This is us. Unfortunately, it's both out of date and incomplete. It's missing both Omer, who's not here with us, and Itamar, who's right here in the front, so everyone can see him. This is our team. We believe that individuals can do an inordinate amount of good through their careers. We think that for most people, your career is the best way you could have a significant positive impact in the world. And we think that this is true for most people, but it's not easy to provide advice that will be true for most people. We think that the best career for you depends on your preferences, it depends on your circumstances, it depends on a lot of speculation about what the future is going to look like and what you think is going to happen. And these facts have a lot of implications for how we try to provide impact-focused career advice. We have an expansive view of the potential domains where you might find your most impactful path in life. We are interested in what are, I think, for this audience, classic, effective altruist cause areas, like global health and development, reducing existential risks, animal welfare. But we think there's a lot more to explore. We're excited about climate change, we're excited about mental health, we're excited about agriculture and others. And we're still actively working on new areas. If you go to our website right now, you'll see a few cause areas. Those are not all the ones we believe are impactful. Those are the ones we've had the time to look into so far. We also, because we think that different people have different needs and different preferences, we try to focus on tools, methodologies, and information that will help you make an informed decision, as opposed to focusing on what are the right conclusions on where you should be and where your career should go. And so we try to support through content and other services that I'll talk about in a moment for people to make their own decisions on this. To try and achieve that, we use a few different sources of information. For almost every profile we try to write, we first do a literature review. Usually this can take a few weeks. In special cases, it might take a few months, trying to find what evidence already exists on high impact opportunities, trying to estimate what is the potential influence of different people at different situations, historically and forward-looking. We do expert interviews, usually between 3 to 7 experts that we sit for an hour-long interview with, and try to tackle with them some of the key questions for how people should be pursuing a path in their area of expertise. That's usually if any of you have heard me say in the past that we have a career profile coming and then have had to wait months until it actually arrived, usually, or the experts we talk to are busy people, so that's usually our biggest blocker on latency. Sometimes we have people internally who have direct experiences working in this space, and so we build on our own experiences when we can, though obviously we cover a lot of careers that we haven't personally been involved in. And finally and importantly, a lot of rounds of feedback. We have a lot of internal feedback. Usually each piece of content goes through many, many iterations. We go back to all the experts we talked with and make sure that they don't think we've said anything that's wrong, misunderstood them, or are missing a key component for the clarity of what we're trying to say. And most importantly, from people like you. Some people have already been giving us feedback on the website. Thank you very, very, very much. And I would like to encourage all of you, if you ever see any of our content and see something that is wrong or unclear, please, there's links to provide feedback. Many of these we just, within a day, receive the feedback, agree, sometimes we disagree, but often agree, and correct it. So thank you to those who have already given feedback, and please do give us feedback whenever you disagree or think we have made a mistake. Using all of this work, we provide several services. There we go. The first piece of value we can provide is a career guide. This is an end-to-end guide to how to direct your career in an impact-focused way. We try to walk you through what does it mean to have an impact, how should I be thinking about my impact in the world, what does it mean to have an impact-focused career, how do you explore, identify, and prioritize careers that will have a significant impact in the world, and how do you put that into practice? What are tools that you can use to find the right career for you? We also publish career path profiles, so these are deep dives into different specific paths you can take and with suggestions. We're going to sample a few of them today. Today we're going to talk about 6 careers. These are only ones that are directly relevant to global health and development. And we're only going to talk about a few conclusions from each one. We're limited in time, so I try to kind of take out some interesting notes on each career, but there's a lot more on all of them on the site, which is probablygood.org. And we also do one-on-one advising. We actually just significantly increased our capacity, and so we're now accepting lots of new applicants. So anyone who wants us to meet up with you, do some homework to find particular opportunities and people to network with that are relevant to your precise plans, talk you through different deliberations and how you could have a significant impact with your career, please do apply. We are actively accepting new applications. And of course, lots of other useful content that you can find on our website. If you've come to this talk, presumably you want to utilize your career to have a significant positive impact. You probably already know that most people can save dozens of lives throughout their career. You probably know that with a lot of hard work and a bit of opportunity, you can do vastly, vastly more than that. But that doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's trivial. Doing that requires work. It requires prioritization. Some paths have a lot more impact than others. Some fail to achieve an impact. Some even do harm, even if they're well-intentioned. And the rest of this talk, we'll talk about tools to do that. Okay, that's what we're here for. But before we do that, I do want to take a moment and say that's not the only important consideration in your career. In addition to all the wonderful ways I hope your careers will help the world, they're also a really important part of your own personal life. They're how you're going to be spending the next 8 hours, maybe even more, of most days of your life, of what I hope will be a many, many decadal career. One of those words. And that means that as opposed to, for example, when you're donating money, if you're donating money, it's important that you think about where you're donating it, but if it's effective and if you're happy with it at the time that you're donating, things will probably be fine. Your career will be there, and you will be there for your career decade after decade. And that means that you need to remain excited about it, you need to remain happy with it, it needs to serve your day-to-day needs. Otherwise, not only will you be unhappy, but you also won't achieve the impact that you're hoping to achieve with your career. And as a result, it's really important to find a career that's both good for you and good for the world. And at least from my perspective, impact-focused advice is tricky. It's tricky to give. And that's because, I was mentioning this before, what the right career for you is depends on your ethical views, right? Who and what you think matters, what principles you care about. It depends on the epistemics that you have, what kind of evidence convinces you that something is true, that something is worth caring about, and different empirical views, what you think is true about the world, what you think the future is going to look like. As a result, I really want to encourage everyone never to choose a career or even a significant career step because someone else told you to take that decision. I think that listening to other people's views on your career is incredibly important. That's why we're doing this work. We think there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of ways in which you can find a better career for you and the world. But you should always engage with those arguments and form your own views on why this is what you should be doing. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because there's a lot that you know and we don't. You know a lot about yourself and your personality and your needs and your goals. You know a lot about your circumstances. Maybe you know a lot about the specific domain you're working in or the country you live in that we don't. We believe that the work that we do and the content that we're about to share is significantly better than making an uninformed guess or just doing an hour or two of Google searches. We've done a lot more than 2 hours of Google searches on this. But it is often less reliable than your direct personal lived experiences. So please use our content as a replacement for lack of knowledge, but not as an override over the knowledge that you already have. And then a second and no less important reason to never make career decisions just because someone told you to make them is because careers are hard and careers are unpredictable. And I'm willing to bet that for each and every person in this room, in 5 years, there will be a lot of things that you have decided and believe today, and you'll find to be untrue in 5 years. Some of your decisions will be suboptimal. Some of them you'll say in hindsight were really bad decisions. And it's a very different feeling if you can look back and say, okay, that's the lesson I now know and couldn't have known back then. Or maybe I should have known back then, and that's how in the future I will make better decisions. We think that's a healthy way of being able to engage with your decisions and your career, as opposed to being stuck in a situation where you're saying, but wait a second, probably good told me this would be promising, and now either I or they discovered that's not true. Why did they mislead me, and why did I waste these 5 years of my life? So please, we would love for people to engage with this content, but please don't just take it for granted. See whether the arguments that we have convince you, rather than the conclusions that we have are necessarily the ones to follow. And if you conclude that you should be going in a different direction, that's wonderful. We need a lot more exploration than I think we're currently getting. Okay. Last piece of context. I talked a lot about careers. Let's talk a moment about global health and development. I assume, since you're all here, you all know that global health and development is a pretty big deal. Let's quickly remind ourselves of just how much. To this day, about 5 million children die every year due to preventable causes. 1 in 11 people living today live on less than $2 a day, of course, purchasing power adjusted, which is the standard, or 190 is the standard for global extreme poverty. These numbers, let's not be too pessimistic, are strikingly better than they were just a few decades ago. And that's thanks to a lot of wonderful work in this space, but there's a lot of additional work that can be done and that should be done. So with all that said, let's talk about a few high impact paths or careers that we've identified as potentially high impact. As I mentioned, this will only be a taste, so please feel free to dive into the careers you're most interested in on the website. Let's start with development economics. Development economics is a subfield of economics where researchers look into the different causes of poverty, economic development, growth, and other factors that affect the well-being of people in low and middle-income countries. It has a lot of opportunities. Development economists can identify unprecedentedly cost-effective ways to help people in a huge variety of different fields. This is true in health, education, agriculture, disaster management, gender equality, and many, many more. They also have the ability to move truly enormous amounts of resources in a very effective way, especially when they're engaging with governments, but not only. They can move money from what's being effectively having very, very little impact to some of the most cost-effective interventions we know today. Just to give one example of such work, IPA's work with the TamTam nonprofit were able to show that demand for anti-malaria bed nets increases by about 60% if you change the pricing from a small nominal fee to completely free. And they were also able to show in a separate study that the actual usage of these nets doesn't actually go down, which prior it was believed that it does. And as a result, a lot of different funders moved from requiring a nominal fee to not requiring one, vastly increasing the usage of anti-malaria bed nets and reducing malaria incidence. And actually, just within a few years, 43 out of 47 countries in sub-Saharan Africa where such bed net distribution was being done were switched to a fully free distribution. Not everyone is a good fit for every career. So what I want to do is for each career tell you a bit about what you would need to have a good personal fit for that career. For development economics, one thing that's really important is a deep familiarity with the region of interest. In fact, the people who are best placed to help a community or a region are people who are a part of that community, who understand that community, who lived within their lives the day-to-day of that community. If you come from a relevant community, wonderful, you might have a great opportunity to help those around you thanks to your deep understanding of the needs, and if you go learn development economics, a deep understanding of the tool set necessary to be able to help in such situations. If you don't come from a relevant community, you might want to consider living for a few years in the region of interest that you want to work on before assuming that you understand what their needs are and how to intervene. A second thing that's quite important is at least decent quantitative skills. Development economics requires a mix of different things. Again, in the article, there's a longer list of things that might be useful to know. But you do want to have a decent hold of statistics, and other quantitative tools. Econometrics, working with code and data is also very useful. But again, that doesn't need to be your area of kind of deep expertise. You just need to be comfortable with those tools. To try and pursue this career, there are a few things that are useful as good first steps. The first is maybe the most obvious. You should study economics. In your bachelor's, there's not yet a development economics degree. You start with economics. There are other degrees that can lead you to development economics, but the experts we talked to agree that economics gives you the best initial tool set to get started. One thing we've heard consistently is that recommendation letters are exceptionally important in development economics. So you really want to make sure you have, especially as you go on to either advanced degrees or into government or other academic postings, you really want to make sure you have really good recommendation letters. Getting ready for that starts early. You want to make sure you take courses with professors who are well known. You want to participate in class and make sure that important people get to know you. You want to get an advisor that has a lot of clout and preferably writes good recommendation letters, though that's a bit harder to know. But you can talk to previous advisees of professors to get a sense of a lot of these questions. Finally, something that is far, of course, from a necessity to be in this space, but one program we wanted to flag is the MITx MicroMasters in Data Economics and Development Policy. And the reason I want to mention it is because it's a kind of MicroMasters program that is considered quite good. It's a good education, but it's also particularly accessible. So you can start it for free. So if you want to test your own personal fit or your interest, you don't have to pay anything, at least initially. They have significant discounts based on household income, which can be very useful. And they have scholarships for various regions in the world, including Southeast Asia and Brazil. And for those of you who are literally were just waiting for the slide to start your development economics career, applications are due in June. Let's move on to civil service careers. Of course, another way to influence governments is by working in governments and being part of the civil service. LMICs are low and middle income countries. And this is an interesting one because work in government is extremely, extremely variable. There are many, many parts of government where it is very hard to make a significant counterfactual difference. In fact, I personally had a chance to work with quite a significant number of countries in LMICs, and quite a lot of them, it was quite shocking to find out how much every single decision has to go all the way up to the minister, which means it's very hard to make a difference as an individual who is not a minister, and the minister, of course, is politically appointed, so civil service is not a great way to get there. But it turns out, and I think this was our biggest surprise looking into this specific career path, that there are exceptions, and very significant exceptions. Quite a few departments will have large amounts of autonomy. And when that happens, even very junior people can have enormous influence on very large amounts of resources. A famous saying in government is, it's not where you work, but who you work for. We'd highly recommend, if you're interested in a civil service career, to look for people you can work for that both know how to get things done, but provide people under them a lot of autonomy. Now, those resources are not just money, even though indeed governments move around very large amounts of money. It's also regulatory power, it's influence over and access to very influential people, and so on. There are a lot of examples, it turns out, of incredibly, incredibly influential civil servants, even in fairly junior roles. One example of this is a civil servant in India that single-handedly produced about $80 million worth of savings for the Indian government per year just by driving a payment systems reform that was significantly more efficient. The Senegalese civil service introduced free healthcare in 2009, and within 1 year halved all of infant mortality in the country. So obviously these are extreme examples, as all my examples will be. It'll be inspiring, wonderful examples. That's not what we expect a civil servant to do every year of their career, but we think there are really exciting paths to being able to do things in a really large scale. A common way in which civil servants can enable large amounts of change is to be internal champions for important efforts. So we mentioned development economists previously. Development economists often critically depend on finding that one person that gets it, that wants to introduce evidence-based policy, or that understands a need, and then they can be a huge unblocker for being able to do collaborations and approvals. So being a civil servant, identifying high-impact opportunities and working with organizations externally with providing them the context and how to work with your department is an incredibly valuable way to drive huge amounts of change. There are a few things you need to be a good civil servant. I'll only mention a few of them. One is that often you want to be a generalist and a fast learner. Civil servants are often moved a lot from place to place. Maybe this is a good opportunity to mention. I said before that there are some places that are incredibly autonomous and impactful, and it's great to be in them. But in many countries, you don't have the ability to choose where you go, or you have limited ability. How much you have influence over what department you will be in, which is a spectrum, is a really important factor in how promising civil service is in your specific country and in your specific circumstances. So that's important to take into account. But in most countries, you won't have full control. So you'll be moved around a bit, or even if you're staying at the same place, you will have a lot of different things on your plate. Civil service is not the place to be kind of a deep, deep expert in one specific topic. You want to be able to very quickly understand the important core things in a lot of different topics and be able to tackle them. Possibly even more important is the ability to disagree without being disagreeable. Okay, it's really important to disagree sometimes. Okay, if you're just going to do what you're told in government and in other places as well, it's hard to make a significant difference. But often governments have a strong hierarchy, a strong sense of respect and duty and agreeing with what other people say. And so the ability to push back on things, the ability to persuade people, the ability to advance your own ideas but doing so in a way that is incredibly respectful and deferent and pleasant and positive is incredibly important, because your network and your connections are also incredibly important for you being able to do your job. And then finally, as I think we all know, working in government requires patience. Things move slowly in government. They control large amounts of resource, and that comes with a lot of overhead, justifiably. We don't want people doing things too rashly, potentially. And so the shortest timelines are often on the order of magnitude of years until things happen, and sometimes you need to wait decades. So this is not a career for those who are impatient. In terms of getting started, there we go. In terms of getting started, so the most common way to enter the civil service, and specifically influential paths in civil servants, is through the civil service exam. This doesn't exist in all countries, but it exists in a lot of countries, and especially in a lot of low and middle income countries. These are very famous. Often these are very prestigious to get through, and to get to kind of some of the more prestigious paths in civil service, which indeed do have a lot more influence than other civil service paths. But they also have a lot of costs. Often they are incredibly hard to get into, and the larger the country is, and of course the larger it is, that tends to correlate with having more influence, right, and being able to help more people and do more. The larger it is, unfortunately, that dynamic of being extremely hard to get into becomes even larger. To take one extreme example, in India, the IAS, which is kind of the prestigious civil service program, on average candidates study for it for several years and still have about 1 in 1,000 chance of getting in. Okay, so those are some tall odds right there. And as a result, we think that once you've gotten into such a role, this is a really promising path, but recommending people to spend those years for that 1 in 1,000 chance, we're less sure about that we think that's a really big price to pay when you don't know if it's going to work out. But there is another way to enter government, which we think is talked about less and we think is quite promising, which is lateral entry. So you could start your career in a different direction. For example, you could go be an economist or a consultant or work in think tanks or an academic of various kinds, and then move into government once you're already better established elsewhere. This path is particularly common for economists, though exists for other professions as well. And we think it has a bunch of advantages because it makes you invest less and risk less upfront without knowing if you're a good fit. It has a lot of better exit options in case your path in government doesn't work out, and so on. So again, not the path for everyone, but we think that's often an under-considered path. Next up, let's talk about nonprofit entrepreneurship. So I think that's a pretty famous path, and we think that at least when it goes well, it's really very hard to compete with. First, it can have really, truly world-changing impact, and the examples for this are endless, all the way from BRAC, one of the largest and really most significant nonprofits that began in Bangladesh and grew far beyond it, all the way to more recent examples that I'm a huge fan of, the Lead Elimination Exposure Project and Family Empowerment Media, both very young nonprofits that are already showing incredible results in changing the world for the better. And it's also nice because it's pretty clear, at least in the kind of large success cases, that this impact is true, what's called counterfactual impact, that a lot of this would not have happened, or at least not as happened as quickly or as extensively, were it not for the founders there to set up this organization. Often these things are very dependent on not just the idea, but also the execution, and often there's room for more than one organization, but we see that the market doesn't fill itself up, as opposed to, let's say, a lot of for-profit markets, liquid for-profit markets. A lot of things that need to be done aren't done naturally if someone doesn't pitch in and do it themselves. Peter Wildford, back in 2016, estimated that a GiveWell recommended charity, if you manage to successfully create a GiveWell recommended charity, that's about as impactful as if you had gotten all the people that work on that charity and each one of them were to donate about $400,000 to Give Directly, right, an existing give well-recommended charity. These are very, very rough numbers that you should not assume are just true as is, but it gives you kind of a sense of at least what some people think is the order of magnitude of impact you can have with a successful charity. Now, of course, I said that when it goes well, it's incredible. It's not easy to make it go well. So first of all, I think most people would struggle founding a charity. It requires a lot of well-rounded traits. Possibly most important are independence and grit, though there's a lot of other things you need. You'll need interpersonal connections to manage people, to fundraise, and so on. You'll need a lot of executive abilities to be able to actually run things through, and so on. But even if you are a good fit, it requires a lot of risk tolerance because these things fail. It's a high-risk, high-reward opportunity or path. And it's also high risk, by the way, in the potential to do harm. Nonprofits, the third sector, is often, incentives are not always aligned. Just because you are successfully fundraising, just because you're successfully executing your vision, doesn't necessarily mean you're doing a lot of benefit rather than doing harm. So we think it's incredibly important that when you do that, to be able to understand what is the effect that you're having, measure those things, work maybe with some development economists we mentioned before, and make sure that you're having a positive impact rather than a harmful impact. There are several ways to kind of get started, check your own fit, prepare yourself for founding your own charity. Maybe the simplest and earliest one, before you take huge risks and kind of make large commitments, it is really valuable to try and do mini versions of this in your life. Start your own project. Try to lead things. Get a bunch of friends. Do something that is important and cool, that is within your capacity, and see if you enjoy it and see if you do that successfully. Okay? Please do not dedicate years of your life before you even spend a weekend trying to do things that are somewhat similar to this thing. The second thing that I'm assuming some people here, many people here already know, is of course the organization Charity Entrepreneurship, which does a lot of things to help found effective charities. This includes their incubation program, where you can get a lot of guidance on how to start a charity, ideas for charities, and help with finding co-founders. They published a book with lots of tools and advice for both how to found charities and how to make sure that they are effective at their goals, and they provide lots and lots of other resources. So you can just search for Charity Entrepreneurship and find them. And then finally, before that last point, I'll just say you can also work at existing small nonprofits to see what the founders are doing right now and kind of see what it looks like and learn about that before you start your own charity, or intern at one if that's the stage in your career. And then finally, when you do start a charity, two things you want to think really, really hard about is one, choosing your intervention and making sure that's one that is significant and effective and has a potential to have a large-scale impact. And secondly, your co-founders, which are, by some people, the second most important relationship you will ever have. According to other people, the first most important relationship you will ever have. Important to think about through. It's hard to run an organization with someone you don't really, really trust and really enjoy working with. Next up, let's talk about another component of the value chain of trying to execute interventions and provide change, and that is monitoring and evaluation specialists. So M&E specialists will collect, track, analyze, and in general process data to both assess the value and impact of an intervention and then convey those insights to decision makers so that they can improve their strategies and increase the impact of the whole organization or the project. That often involves forming the right metrics, designing data collection methods, and developing, kind of translating those into actionable insights that will actually help the organization. We think the case for M&E specialists is quite similar to development economists. There's also a lot of overlap. A lot of people do both things. But often M&E specialists will be more embedded in an organization. They will do more day-to-day ongoing monitoring and will be participating in smaller studies than development economists. And for some people, there are pros and cons for these two different approaches. M&E specialists, at least when they are given the opportunity to do so, can be really a significant difference between whether an organization is effective or not. According to the Center for Global Development, they did a review of all World Bank funded projects, and they found that those projects that had what kind of was denoted as significant M&E, significant evaluation, were about 58%, is that 58? Where's the number there? 53% more likely to succeed than projects that were denoted as having negligible measurement and evaluation. There seems to be a strong correlation between how well you're checking whether what you're doing is working and whether what you do ends up working. Who would have thought? There are a bunch of examples of ways they've helped. Many of the same examples as development economists, right? We mentioned before the anti-malaria bed nets example, but I'll give another couple of examples. So for example, conditional cash transfers in Mexico, as well as studies about showing how free lentils as an incentive to vaccination were really significant in shifting the world towards using conditional cash transfers, which previously were used much, much less in previous decades. And a lot of other changes that changed not only the organization that they're working in, but also the field as a whole with generalizable conclusions, like the rise of what's called targeting the ultra-poor programs, microloans, for better or worse. People have very strong opinions about it, but these studies are changing not just what you do and the organization you work for, but can, if done well, change what a lot of organizations do as well. In terms of personal fit, so much like development economists, it's very important to understand the region you're working in and focusing on. One thing that we've heard that M&E specialists do a lot is first dive into the data, and good ones will do that very well, will understand how even with a lot of messy data that's a bit hard to understand, how to extract justifiable insights while throwing away things that might be noise. And secondly, presenting that information to others. Being able to not just understand it, but to really translate it to people who will need to make decisions based on it. To get started, so a few recommendations. So one, the M&E universe is a nice resource with a lot of different kind of materials on a lot of different aspects of M&E. In all these slides, I had to choose like 2 or 3 bullet points. There's a lot of different resources. I don't know if the M&E universe is like the best one on the actual profile. You'll see a lot of others, but that's like a relatively big one. So I thought if I need to choose one, let's go with that one. It's highly recommended to learn scripting or statistical software, or both. They're not always required. They're required for some roles. For others, they're not required, but we would still recommend doing that. We think they empower you to do a lot more that you couldn't do otherwise, or do it a lot more efficiently and effectively. And then just one example, again, definitely not a necessity, but one particularly prestigious path for people who are still in an early stage in the career, so you can do it at an early stage, is the World Bank Group Young Professionals Program, which is very, very well regarded and puts you in a good place later to do a lot of different things, but it is very competitive, so don't bank on that, but it's worth a try. Next up, we have grant-making. Of course, all of these wonderful things can only happen if someone is paying for them, and when that's not the government, that will often be grant makers. And there's a bunch of advantages. Maybe I'll just say grant makers, of course, are not relevant only to global health and development. They're relevant to a lot of other spaces, but I think they're particularly important in global health and development, as opposed to, let's say, other causes that people talk about in this conference. And global health and development really is funding constrained in a way that at least some other areas are not. And so being a grant maker and making sure where to send, where is the most efficient places to send money is quite important. Grant makers control reasonably large amounts of money, usually substantially more than what you would be able to do to control if you were, let's say, earning to give. Possibly not as large as often governments control, and even civil servants might be able to control. But one big advantage that they have is that they often have large autonomy over that money, at least if they're in a relatively senior role, like a program officer or above. So we think that's kind of allows you to direct quite autonomously quite large amounts of money in a way that gives a lot of opportunities. And then finally, I'll just say on advantages for grant making is really exceptional career capital. It puts you in touch with a lot of people in the field you're interested in, and a lot of important people in the field you're interested, and puts you in a pretty good position with them, in a strong position of trust, whether you've given them money or you were just a funder yourself. It's very convenient to do other things after you've been a grant maker, so it's pretty great for career capital. A couple of things that are really important to check if you're a good fit for grant making is one, really strong interpersonal skills. And when I say interpersonal skills, I don't mean just being able to build good relationships and network. Those are very important things for grant makers. A lot of what grant makers do is networking to find the opportunities that they need. But it's also being able to quickly and effectively judge the character of others and being able to influence either other people in the fund or in the field or the grantees that you're working with, being on the one hand being able to push them in a positive direction, but doing that in a positive, amiable way. A second thing that is really important, not just to being, it's actually not necessarily important to getting a job as a grant maker and keeping your job as a grant maker, but really important to making sure you're doing the right thing with that job is being self-critical. One of the downsides of grant making is that it'll put you in a situation with horrible incentives and horrible feedback loops. Okay, if you control the money, suddenly everyone thinks your jokes are funny, and everyone thinks all of your ideas are great. And the bad news is all of your ideas are not great. Some of your ideas are bad, but you will be told that much, much less. So you need to A, be more self-critical yourself, and B, actively seek constructive feedback, because it'll be rare, but it will be important. So that it's really, really important to make sure you don't use your power in a way that will actually ossify the field and do harm rather than doing good. First steps. We actually don't recommend going into grant making as a first step. Not only is it hard to get a grant making role as a first step, we've heard a lot of not great things about junior roles in foundations. Often these roles don't have a good culture of growth, of feedback, of learning, and people tend to not go from junior roles to senior roles. If you go in as a junior role, you're often stuck in a junior role. So we would recommend going into grant making later. Since we are in EA Global, I think it's worth mentioning that dynamic is not necessarily true in EA grant making organizations. Junior grant maker roles in EA organizations look very different in many different ways from junior grant making roles in most foundations. So this is a statement about most foundations, but a lot of things that I mentioned here and that we write in the profile, you'll see we mention it, don't apply. So this is kind of more about general grant making. If you're interested in a junior grant making role in an EA organization, feel free to reach out. We can talk about the pros and cons of that specifically. What we do recommend is to really pursue something else in the field you're interested in, and at a later stage in your career, you might be able to transition to grant making, and we think at that stage, it'll be a promising path. Finally, prioritization research. This is the only path that is not really a well-recognized career path. If you say prioritization researcher, most people will not know what you're talking about, but we think it's an important and distinct enough path to be worth referencing directly. Broadly, prioritization researchers try to combine tools from different sources, from different domains, including economics, philosophy, and others, and to try and prioritize what is important to do. This goes all the way from the tactical, like comparing between specific interventions to achieve the same goal, all the way to the strategic, comparing between completely different cause areas. And we think this is very important. The vast majority of prioritization that we, and I assume you, engage with, often there are very deep holes that just due to capacity, we have not yet had time to properly look into. If you talk to people at GiveWell, they'll tell you a long list of uncertainties that are critical for their analysis, but they don't have yet capacity to look into. If you talk to OpenPhil, most people who would want to receive funding from Open Philanthropy don't fall in their existing focus cause areas, and OpenPhil will say openly that if someone did some analysis that shows that a different area was particularly promising, and there's a lot of areas they didn't look into, then they'd be open to opening a program on it. So there's still a lot more to look into. But just because there's a lot more to do doesn't mean that it's very easy to get paid to do it. It is a very competitive field, the number of paid positions for prioritization research, even though there are a bunch. There are some in think tanks, there are some in effective altruism organizations, there are sometimes some in governments. There's a lot of different places you can find these roles, but still the number of roles in absolute terms is still sometimes hard. To be able to do it well, maybe the most difficult thing you need to do is be able to tackle hard and ambiguous problems. Holden Karnofsky's posts about wicked problems, as he calls them, is a good way to understand what type of hard problems we're thinking about and what is the challenge in tackling them. And then they also require combining quantitative and qualitative methods. Often we need some quantitative analysis to be able to meaningfully prioritize, to say things that are reliable in terms of scale and prioritization, and yet a lot of times we don't have enough data for it to make sense to do quantitative things, and a lot of qualitative methodologies are important to doing this. And even just identifying when you want to use which is another potential challenge. To get started, again, it can be hard to get started in this field because it's so competitive, but you can look for internships, research training programs, and do some of your own independent research. In the full profile, we actually share lists of internships and research training programs and funders that are open to providing funding for independent researchers in this space. And even more exciting, I think, we've developed together with GiveWell about 15 to 20 hours of test tasks that you can use either to check your own personal fit for this path, or to see if you enjoy it and good at it, and to prepare yourself if you're going to try and apply to roles. We highly recommend doing this work. It is based on GiveWell's past tests. It's based on questions that were real tests to get into prestigious roles in this space, but ones that are no longer in use. You won't see any of those questions in the actual GiveWell test today, but it's very useful to understand what kind of questions you're going to be asked and what kind of work they'll want you to do. Okay, I want to make sure before that, as I hope was clear from the way I opened this talk, we don't think these are the only promising careers. These are the intersection between things we've looked at and things we found to be promising. There's others we haven't looked at. We also talked only about global health and development careers. We have other careers on the website if you're interested. And we might be wrong. So please look at our justifications rather than trusting us. But we do think that all of these careers have some very, very promising paths to doing really impactful work. I'll go quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions about 3 pieces of advice that we've found across many different career paths that are relevant to global health and development. The first is you really need to listen to your audience or your recipients. I can guarantee that in the first time you try out an intervention or a project, you will have some misconceptions on what is needed. And so talk to people, understand what they need before you've started out, after you've done the first version of whatever you're trying to do. Listen to the people you're trying to help. Second is each one of these paths has its own misaligned incentives. In academia, there's the kind of publish or perish type of approach. In civil service, often you'll have opportunities to advance yourself at the expense of, to try and not rock the boat. In entrepreneurship, you can just listen to what the funders want or try to gain market share when really in a nonprofit you really shouldn't be. In M&E, the organization might be pressuring you to make them look good rather than flag when things are going terribly wrong. It's really important to know how to work within the system, but also push against the system when it matters. And then finally, just mention, I think a common mistake that people who really care about their career's impact and care enough to come to talks like this, a mistake that these kinds of people tend to make, myself included, is overplanning. Is trying to think about what is the perfect path for my career, what are all the things I want to do, where exactly do I want to get, and then spend a decade trying to make that happen. The world is complex, and you will have very unexpected opportunities and challenges. It is very important to be open to opportunities even if you didn't plan them. A sufficiently good opportunity is worth it even if it's not directly in the direction you thought you were going to go, whether that's because it'll make it easier to jump back with even bigger opportunities when you do come back to where you're planning, or you'll just find opportunities you weren't thinking of before. Okay, just to finish out some last notes. So please do talk to us, where we'd love to see if we can help. Online, we're at probablygood.org, but here at EA Global, we have a bunch of us here physically. My office hours are right now in the place that Vaish said before, which I don't know. Yeah, feel free to reach out to any of us. You can find us on the swap card ad. Just look for the organizations at Probably Good. We'd all love to talk to you. And good luck with impactful careers.
So if anyone needs to leave now but would like to come drop into the office hours later, it's at Quayside 2. And just a reminder, you can still send in questions if you haven't yet. Great. Thank you, Sella. Okay, so I think there's a few questions here. I'll take them in reverse order because the first one that came up, I noticed you recommended some very competitive career paths. How do you think about / should applicants think about marginal benefit in this context?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is very different in different career paths, and I won't have time to go through all the kind of considerations, but I think one really important one is to understand whether the role that you're applying to is already by definition intended to maximize for the positive impact that it's having, versus ones where they may be competitive, but what most people are trying to do is not necessarily try to achieve positive impact. Because in the first case, then you really would expect that someone else who's incredibly talented would have very significant positive impact even if you don't apply. Though it is worth mentioning that if you do apply and you do get in, you're freeing up someone who's very interested in doing a lot of positive impact and very talented to do something else that is very important. So someone will need to do that job. It's either you or the other person. If you do the counterfactual impact and include all the consequences, including what they will do with their career, I think that still ends up being pretty promising. The second one is more interesting, and I think the most extreme example of this is earning to give, right? You can be in a very competitive job that earns a lot of money. Most people would, buy Ferraris with that money or whatever, but you plan on donating it to important and effective causes. In that case, the fact that it's competitive is completely irrelevant to the question. It's clear that pretty much all of your impact will be counterfactual impact. So exactly how it affects your impact depends, but I do think that overall your actual impact, taking into consideration all counterfactual considerations, is probably closer to kind of what impact you're directly having than doing this version of I'm only thinking about the fact that someone else would do that same job without considering that they would go do another job. So overall, I think direct impact is, again, a very imperfect consideration, a perfect proxy for impact, but I think not a terrible proxy for impact in most cases.
And I'm guessing this sort of dovetails off of the civil service discussion, and in that case, like the India example you gave, presumably the consideration is how likely the next person on that line is to share your values and push for the same things. There's a couple more questions around this civil service thing, so I'll just maybe stick to that. How well does your advice generalize over different countries and regions? Do you have countries you focus more than others? And related question, is it advisable to be a civil servant as a foreigner in brackets, white savior question mark, in an LMIC, or would it be better to do community building locally to suggest this career path to local citizens?
Yeah, these are really great questions. So I think in terms of how well it generalizes across countries, so countries are very diverse and things are very different. So I think this relates to the point I was making in the beginning, where often you will know a lot of things about the country you're in, or in this context, the civil service in the country you're in, that might override what our project says. We try to explore a lot of different areas where there, a lot of different countries and the civil service there, and try to flag where there's diversity and where at least we didn't see diversity, which doesn't mean there isn't additional diversity that we haven't seen. Specifically, we tried to focus mostly on countries with large populations where both a lot of potential people reading this article might be from, and we think there's a lot of impact to be had. So India, Nigeria, Brazil, these are countries we looked at disproportionately, or proportionately to population maybe. But yeah, please, and we try to maybe write down what are the considerations. So like I said before, it's kind of worth checking how much autonomy you have or what departments in your civil service will have. So hopefully it can help you navigate how to make that decision as opposed to just like saying, oh, it is promising or it isn't promising. Regarding whether it's good to go into civil service if you're a foreigner, so I think if you're a foreigner who doesn't understand, who hasn't lived for a long time in the country, I think that is a big, hit. I would be much less enthusiastic about civil service in that scenario. If you do understand, but it's just, your nationality is not from the country, but you've been there for many years, I think potentially you might be able to do good work, though of course it depends a bit on the culture of the country, but it might still, and also, of course, the laws and regulation over civil service in the country, that might be still very limited. So this is a good example of something that really would depend country by country.
So unfortunately, we're at the end of time. And again, if you want to discuss your kind of personal circumstances, feel free to either visit our website or apply for advising or talk to Sella at office hours later. Thank you.